We think of Vikings as fierce warriors, raiders of coasts, and conquerors of kingdoms. But what came after the battle was far worse than the clash of swords. When the shouting stopped and the smoke faded, a new kind of horror began. It wasn't the warriors who suffered, it was the women they left behind. The maids of the defeated were not spared. For them, survival was the beginning of a different kind of death. What the Vikings did was not random cruelty. It was a system, planned, recorded, and justified by law. Every raid, every victory, brought with it a shadow that swallowed the lives of women across Europe. If this system had not existed, thousands would not have vanished without a trace. Their pain became part of the very fabric of the North. Their suffering was written not in books, but in bloodlines, passed down through generations. When the warriors fell, their maids were taken. Chronicles speak of bravery and conquest, but fall silent about what followed. Archaeologists found iron shackles small enough for wrists and ankles, proof of captivity. In Dublin and York, the remains of slave markets show how organized it was. Women were priced like cattle, 20 silver coins for the young, 15 for mothers, 10 for those injured. Receipts carved into stone record these transactions. The Vikings didn't just take gold. They took lives. This wasn't chaos, it was commerce. Viking leaders turned human suffering into trade. Each market had docks, storage rooms, and holding pens for captives. The infrastructure of terror was as advanced as their ships. Their wealth didn't come from plundered treasures alone. It came from the sale of the conquered. The cruelty went deeper. Norse law made it legal. When a warrior died, his killer had the right to claim his wife or servant as property. The Old Norse word kona meant owned woman. She had no voice, no choice, no escape. Her captor declared ownership before witnesses, making the act lawful. The violence was not a crime, it was a right. In rituals, women were forced to die beside their masters. Burials found across Scandinavia show signs of strangulation and drugging before death. The victims were subdued, silenced, and buried with the men who had owned them. To the Vikings, it was an honor ritual. To the women, it was a nightmare that ended only with death, but the system eventually turned inward. As the Viking Age collapsed, the same men who once captured others killed their own. Archaeologists have found graves filled with Norse women murdered by their families. Inscriptions carved into bone read, "Better this way." The raiders who once destroyed other lives now destroyed their own to avoid seeing them enslaved. Even when the Viking kingdoms fell, their practices survived. Norman rulers and the church adopted the same system under new names: servitude, indenture, marriage. Women were still treated as property, traded for land, status, or peace. The structure changed, but the suffering continued. Modern science confirms what the chronicles omitted. DNA analysis shows that Norse bloodlines carry traces of Celtic and Saxon women taken as captives. It wasn't migration. It was violation repeated over centuries. Each strand of DNA is a record of what the sagas refused to write. The Vikings left behind sagas of glory, but the real story lies in the soil, in bones, in graves, in bloodlines. Their empire was built not just on war, but on women who were never meant to be remembered. Their silence shaped nations, their pain built kingdoms, and their forgotten names echo through time. If you believe history should not hide its darkest truths, subscribe. It helps us continue uncovering the stories that were buried, the voices that were taken, and the lives that were silenced. The monastery at Clonmacnoise fell to Thorgils and his fleet in the year 845. Chronicles record the slaughter of 43 monks defending the altar, but they say nothing about what happened after. The words stop, the ink runs dry, but the evidence does not. Archaeologists found the truth buried in the soil: chains, iron shackles built for women's wrists, ankle rings small enough for children, and storage rooms built not for food, but for people. These discoveries came from the heart of Dublin, once a thriving Viking port. The remains told a story the sagas never dared to mention. Dublin's Norsemen didn't only take gold and silver, they took bodies. Human lives turned into property. In the markets, women were priced like animals. 20 silver coins for the young, 15 for mothers, 10 for those wounded during capture. The figures were carved into stone tablets found in Schleswig, proof written in runes. These were not legends or myths. They were receipts. The Norse had created an economy of suffering. In 862, another attack came. The Vikings raided Portmorrow, a small settlement along the Irish coast. The annals record 47 men killed in battle, but no one mentioned the 53 women taken. Nearby bogs filled in the silence. Archaeologists uncovered 23 female bodies buried in dark soil. Their injuries were deliberate. Skulls struck from behind, ribs crushed, arms broken from defense. These were not battle wounds. They were executions. Each one carried out days after the raid, after decisions had been made. The pattern appeared again in 871, when the great heathen army captured Reading. Chronicles note the defeat of King Ethelred, but stay silent about what happened inside the palace walls. Excavations told the rest. Stones stained with blood, the residue of iron oxide left behind by decay. Enough to suggest dozens of deaths. The violence was not random, it followed rules. Old Norse law was brutally clear. When a warrior killed another man, he gained the right to claim the dead man's wife. She was called kona, meaning owned woman, property that could breathe, walk, and bear children. Icelandic law codes describe the process. The captor stood before witnesses and declared his claim aloud. The woman's consent didn't matter. Her silence was enough. Once claimed, the union was legal. Any children born from it were legitimate. These laws were recorded in the Gragas, the ancient Icelandic codes. They spelled out every detail, even the time limit for the claim. The captor had 3 days to declare ownership. If he failed, another man could contest it. Women were fought over like livestock, traded and reclaimed as prizes of war, but the cruelty didn't stop with marriage. In 878, Norse raiders destroyed the monastery at Bangor. The Irish annals mention only its fall, not what came next. Burned layers at the site told the rest. Bone fragments arranged in ritual patterns belonging to women. Norse funerary customs demanded sacrifice. When a warrior died, his weapons, horses, and women followed him. Eyewitness accounts confirm it. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler, described such a ritual on the Volga River in 921. A female slave was forced to drink, abused, and killed to accompany her master in death. Archaeology supports his account. Boat burials in Scandinavia revealed women's skeletons with marks of strangulation and traces of henbane, a hallucinogenic drug used to dull their senses before death. They were alive when the funeral began, and dead when the flames rose. By the year 907, the Viking army camped at Thetford in England. Chronicles speak of stolen cattle and burned churches, but remain silent about the captives. Excavations at the camp unearthed the bones of infants, tiny skulls showing blunt force trauma. Not stillbirths, but murders. Viking law decreed that a slave's child was also a slave. If it could not work, it was killed. Brutal economics shaped human life. Centuries later, the Domesday Book still recorded traces of these practices under Norman rule. Population gaps appeared exactly where Viking settlements had been. Excavations at Repton confirmed the connection. 249 skeletons from the Great Army's encampment, but only 63 were women. The rest had vanished. Isotope analysis showed the women buried there were Dublin, York, and Hedeby were not only Viking strongholds, they were markets, centers of trade where human lives were bought and sold. What seemed like victory on the battlefield ended as business at the docks. Ships came in heavy with captives and left filled with profit. Women, children, and the weak became part of a system that treated flesh as currency. This wasn't chaos. It was commerce. The records are exact. In Dublin's Norse Quarter, archaeologists uncovered ledgers carved into wooden planks and runic stones. They listed transactions with brutal simplicity. 20 silver coins for youth, 15 for mothers, 10 for those broken. Each number represented a life, a body, a story that ended in silence. These weren't random scribbles left by merchants. They were receipts. They turned suffering into an organized trade, clean, structured, and cruel. York in northern England became one of the busiest ports for this human traffic. Excavations in its old market district revealed iron shackles, scales for weighing silver, and coins from as far away as Baghdad. The Norse weren't simply raiders. They were global traders. The silver they used often came from the east, melted and recast for new exchanges. The trade connected three worlds: Scandinavia, Europe, and the Islamic markets along the Volga River. Every link in that chain was built on the backs of captives. At Hedeby, the same pattern appeared. Layers of earth revealed traces of slave enclosures, narrow wooden cells meant for holding people. Iron bars sealed the exits. Even drainage systems were designed to manage waste from crowded human pens. The evidence showed these were not temporary shelters, but permanent facilities for storing slaves. Viking craftsmanship was precise. They built their prisons as carefully as they built their ships. The documents and artifacts align perfectly. Runes from Denmark speak of trade in white goods, a coded term for human slaves. It appears beside lists of furs, amber, and ivory. The Vikings had found a way to disguise their trade in language while keeping their profits in the open. Their economy depended on this silent business. Each raid restocked the markets. Each market fueled new raids. The cycle was endless. The coldest truth lies in the numbers. A single longship could hold around 20 women chained and packed below deck. A large fleet meant hundreds of captives at a time. Markets in Dublin expanded year after year to meet the growing demand. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, shows constant rebuilding of the docks, proving steady growth. Not for fishing, not for trade in furs, but for people. The Vikings had turned slavery into science. Age, strength, and fertility became categories. Young women fetched the highest price. Mothers were less valuable. The injured and old were discounted. Those who resisted were marked as damaged goods. These numbers repeated across markets from Ireland to the Baltic. The system was consistent, regulated, and cruelly efficient. Archaeologists describe it as the first large-scale organized slave trade in northern Europe. Every tool, every ledger, every ship served one purpose: to move human cargo. Behind the stories of brave explorers and fearless warriors stood accountants, builders, and merchants who managed it all. The sagas praised heroism. The soil preserves the truth, and beneath that truth is a silence heavier than iron. This wasn't chaos. It was commerce. The Vikings didn't just raid for glory, they raided for profit. And for every coin that changed hands, a life was taken, priced, and forgotten. Not locals, but captives brought from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Those who died in childbirth or disease were buried. The rest were sold. Viking Dublin had become the heart of a trade network that stretched east into the Islamic markets along the Russian rivers. Each ship carried about 20 women, their fates written in wood and water. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating of Dublin's harbour posts, revealed 60 years of continuous rebuilding between 841 and 970. The docks grew not for fishing, but for human cargo. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a structure, a machine of slavery that powered an empire. Every artifact, every bone, every rune tells the same story. The Vikings didn't just conquer land, they conquered people. And the maids of the defeated were their most valuable spoils. The cruelty of the Vikings was not wild or lawless. It was written into their laws, carved into their stones, and blessed by their gods. Norse society did not see captives as people. They were called kona, a word that meant owned woman, property that breathes, walks, and speaks, but does not belong to itself. The law didn't just allow this ownership, it demanded it. The system turned violence into order and ownership into ritual. It wasn't forbidden, it was required. Old Icelandic law codes, known as the Gragas, describe these customs in chilling detail. When a warrior killed another man in battle, he gained the right to claim the dead man's wife. The captor had 3 days to make his claim before witnesses. He would stand before the group and announce her as his property. The woman had no choice, no voice, and no escape. The declaration made the act legal. What began as assault became marriage. The law did not see her as a victim. It saw her as proof of victory. The Norse were not ashamed of these customs. They recorded them proudly. Runes and legal texts described the transfer of ownership with the same tone used for land or livestock. The same word used for a field, fey, was used for a woman. The laws even stated that if a captured woman took her own life to escape, her captor could demand payment from her family for the loss of property. Suicide was not seen as freedom. It was theft, but the horror did not end with law. Religion added its own layer of cruelty. In Norse belief, a warrior was never meant to go to the afterlife alone. His death required companions, his horses, his weapons, and his women. When a great man died, his servants and captives were chosen to follow him. The sacrifice was not a crime. It was an honor, demanded by custom and celebrated in ritual. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia confirm these practices. In boat burials discovered in Oseberg, Kaupang, and Birka, female skeletons lie beside their masters, their bones telling stories the sagas never did. Many showed signs of strangulation, grooves pressed deep into the neck bones. Others carried traces of henbane, a hallucinogenic plant that dulled the senses. The women were drugged before the killing began. Their deaths were calm, silent, and organized. Ibn Fadlan, an Arab traveler in 921, wrote of such a funeral along the Volga River. He saw a slave girl offered as a gift to her dead master. She was given wine, beaten, and finally killed while the crowd sang and cheered. The body was placed beside her master, and the ship was set on fire. Archaeology now proves this was no isolated story. It was tradition. Each burial uncovered shows the same pattern, controlled violence performed like a ceremony. The Norse did not hide it. They believed it ensured safe passage to the afterlife. The gods demanded blood and society obeyed. In their world, morality was reversed. Killing a captive could bring honor. Sparing one could bring shame. The line between faith and law vanished. A man's authority extended beyond life, and even in death, it reached into the bodies of the women he owned. These laws and rituals were not accidents of barbarism. They were systems written in runes, practiced in villages, and passed down for generations. They turned cruelty into order, and faith into justification. In Viking culture, violence was never just tolerated. It was structured, celebrated, and sanctified. The law called it justice. The priests called it devotion. The victims called it mercy when death finally came. By the middle of the 10th century, Viking power began to fade. Their empires broke apart, their kings fell, and the great armies that once ruled the seas turned against themselves. What the Vikings had done to others for generations, they finally did to themselves. The same cruelty they built their world on returned to consume them. The raiders, who once captured women and sold them into slavery, now killed their own to keep them from being taken. As their settlements collapsed and defeat became certain, the old laws still ruled their minds. They believed that capture was worse than death. Archaeologists have uncovered graves that prove how far this belief went. In Repton, in the heart of England, a mass burial site was found. 236 bodies, all female. The bones showed signs of blunt trauma, strangulation, and poisoning. The soil layers revealed the deaths didn't happen in one night, but over several days. It wasn't panic. It was order. It was planned. Isotope tests revealed something even more shocking. The women buried there were not enemies or captives. They were Norse-born, from the same homelands as the men who killed them. They were wives, daughters, and servants of the Vikings themselves. When the army fell and the walls closed in, the men turned their blades inward. To them it was mercy. To history it was horror. One of the skulls held a final message. Carved into the bone in runes were 3 words, "Better this way." The cut marks were made after death, as if the killers were justifying what they had done. The skull belonged to a girl no older than 14. Tests showed she had been born in Norway, brought to England as a child, and killed by her own people when defeat came. Even in death, they needed to believe their cruelty had purpose. The same scenes appeared across the north. At sites in Denmark, Scotland, and northern England, archaeologists have found similar mass graves filled only with women. Many showed the same pattern. Family groups, mothers and daughters buried together, all killed at once. The methods were the same. Fractured skulls, broken ribs, traces of poison. It was systematic, not spontaneous. These weren't murders of rage. They were rituals of control. The Vikings had spent centuries believing that women were property, that their worth was in obedience and silence. When the system began to collapse, they could not see another way to protect them except by ending their lives. The logic of ownership consumed itself. The men who once enslaved others could not imagine their own wives enslaved. So they killed them. In their minds, it was an act of protection, a twisted echo of the same laws that once allowed them to claim women as spoils. To spare them from the fate they had forced on others, they chose death. But the graves tell a different story. They show fear, desperation, and guilt carved into the earth. The sagas say nothing of this. The chronicles remain silent. But the soil remembers. The bones hold proof of what they tried to bury. The violence they spread across nations came home to them in the end. The Viking world didn't fall because of invasion or famine. It collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty. By the time the last Norse king fell, the system had already destroyed itself. The warriors who once ruled the seas left behind nothing but graves and ghosts. Their legacy was not courage or conquest. It was the silence of those they killed to avoid being conquered. In the end, the masters became the executioners of their own blood. The empire that began in fire ended in ash, and the words carved into that girl's skull still whisper across 1,000 years, "Better this way." When the Viking Age ended, the story of violence did not. The weapons grew quiet, but the system they built continued under new names. The Norse were defeated, yet their legacy lived on in bloodlines, laws, and beliefs. The raids stopped, but the chains did not. The names changed. The chains didn't. Modern DNA studies reveal what the old chronicles refused to record. Across Iceland, Norway, and parts of Britain, scientists have found that most Norse female ancestry doesn't come from Scandinavia at all. Around 60% of women in Iceland today trace their maternal DNA to Celtic lands, to Ireland and Scotland. In Norway, nearly 40% of female lines come from the British Isles. These weren't immigrants or traders. They were captives, taken across the sea centuries ago. The genetic record still carries their memory. For generations, these women were forced into Norse families. They bore children for men who once called them property. Over time, their languages and cultures disappeared, but their blood remained. Every Viking child born to a captive woman carried the story of violence inside their cells. The DNA that survives today is not a tale of love or alliance. It is proof of forced union, generation after generation. As Christianity spread through the north, the church did not erase the old system. It absorbed it. The trade in women simply changed its name. What the Vikings called kona, owned woman, became servant or bride. The word was softened, but the meaning stayed. Churches recorded these unions as marriages, sanctified by faith, but built on the same foundation of power and silence. Monasteries that once condemned the Norse later practiced similar control. Records from England and France list female dependents alongside livestock and land. Women were no longer chained in markets, but bound by contracts and vows. Their bodies and their labor still belonged to others. The same system of ownership continued, only now it spoke the language of God. When the Norman rulers took power after 1066, they perfected it. They brought Viking law and Christian order together. Land grants listed women as property. Noble marriages became tools for conquest. Saxon women were given to Norman knights to legitimize control of land and bloodline. The conquerors didn't need ships anymore. They conquered through lineage. The system of domination had evolved into something quieter, but no less cruel. Even in the centuries that followed, traces of this control remained in law and culture. Women could not own land. Their children carried their father's name, but not their mothers. The idea that a woman's worth came from her obedience survived long after the Viking ships had vanished from the seas. What began with chains and runes became written in scripture and law. Archaeology, genetics, and records all point to the same truth. The Viking world ended, but the structure it built became the foundation of medieval Europe. The trade in women turned into the trade of marriage and inheritance. The violence grew softer in form, but not in meaning. It lived on in systems of class, religion, and bloodline that lasted for centuries. The Vikings are gone, but their shadow remains. The faces of their descendants still carry the traces of those who were taken. The women who vanished into their households shaped nations without ever being remembered. Their pain became invisible, their names forgotten, their voices erased. Yet the evidence endures, not in stone or saga, but in the living people of today. History often remembers the warriors and kings, but DNA remembers the captives. It records the truth written in silence. The Viking Age may have ended 1,000 years ago, but its legacy never truly died. It simply changed its form, hiding inside the blood of the very people who tell its story. We remember the Vikings as fearless warriors, explorers, and kings. Their stories fill books and sagas, carved into memory as tales of bravery and conquest. But behind those legends stand the women they tried to erase. The maids of the defeated, the captives, the slaves, the forgotten. They were not part of the sagas because the victors never meant for their stories to survive. Yet in silence they endured. Their bones, their blood, and their buried voices tell the truth the poets refused to write. Every excavation, every discovery brings them back to life in fragments. Chains found beneath the soil, runes carved into skulls, DNA that carries traces of faraway lands, all speak louder than the myths. These women were the foundation of the world the Vikings built. Without them, there would have been no families, no dynasties, no future generations to carry the Norse name. Their suffering, hidden behind walls of legend, became the silent core of an empire. For centuries, their pain was buried beneath stories of honor and heroism. But the evidence beneath our feet tells another tale. The Vikings' true legacy was not their ships or their battles. It was the women who bore the scars, who carried their conquerors' children, who lived and died unseen. The empires of the north rose on their backs and in their blood. History praised the men who swung the swords, but it was the women who paid the price for their glory. Their names are gone, but their presence remains. In the soil of Repton, in the docks of Dublin, in the DNA of millions across the north, they live on. The sagas may have chosen silence, but the earth remembers everything. It remembers the screams, the fires, the graves, and the broken bones. It remembers the lives turned into property. It remembers the girls who never saw freedom again. Archaeology uncovers what pride once hid. Every fragment unearthed breaks the illusion of heroism. The same people celebrated as adventurers were also traffickers, enslavers, and killers. The glory fades when the truth rises, and when we look closely, the story of the Vikings becomes not one of conquest, but of consequence. Their myths tell us about courage, but their ruins tell us about cruelty. Every Viking victory left behind a silence filled by women who could not speak. And now, 1,000 years later, that silence has become their voice. The ground beneath the north still whispers their story, a story of strength that came not from the sword, but from survival. Their pain was buried beneath centuries of myth. But the earth remembers what the sagas refuse to tell. If you believe history should be told as it was, not as legend wants it to be, then stay with us. Every story we uncover comes from the soil, the bones, and the forgotten records that others chose to ignore. Real history is not made of heroes and glory. It is made of truth, and sometimes that truth is dark. By subscribing, you help us bring those hidden voices back to light. Each video we create takes time, research, and care to piece together what centuries of silence tried to erase. Your support allows us to keep searching through archives, examining new excavations, and giving a voice to those history left behind. When you comment, share, or subscribe, you're not just watching, you're helping preserve what would otherwise be forgotten. The chronicles often told only one side, the side of kings and conquerors. But the truth, the full truth, belongs to everyone. The lost, the voiceless, the unnamed. We tell their stories because they deserve to be remembered, not rewritten. If you stand for that, if you believe real history shouldn't be polished or hidden, then join us, subscribe, share, and help us keep uncovering the parts of the past that others choose to bury. Every view, every like, every voice helps the silence fade a little more. History is not just what was written, it's what remains. And together, we can make sure those who were erased are finally heard.